Our first word on this list is render. Render is a little bit more complicated than it looks. If you render something, you cause it to be done. It becomes something, you do something. You hear the phrase in literature a lot. For example, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. It's a biblical term indicating the separation of church and state. And the origin of it is fairly simple, but it's not really apparent when you see it. The re, re, we've seen that prefix many times before, means to be back. And the der part comes from the Latin dare, which meant to give. So it means to give back, to give something, to do something. The term is used a lot in many different ways. If you go to a slaughterhouse where they turn or make or do cattle and make it into something usable, you call that a rendering plant. Sort of gross, but that's what we do. Even when I make these movies, once I produce them, they have to be turned into a movie form, and it's a complicated technical thing of where you take data and you conform that data into a movie, and that's called rendering. So it's used in many ways. Thus, render can be used very broadly. It should be paired up with the third definition down, to say or to make. Our second word is dissimulate. That means to disguise or conceal, generally in a false way, tricky way. And you can see the prefix there. We've seen that dis prefix a lot. That means away from. And the root we haven't had yet, but it's pretty obvious. Sim. A similitude was the Latin word for likeness, away from the likeness. You get away from the likeness means to be false, away from what's true. We get all sorts of words with sim. Similar, for example, comes from the Latin. So it's away from the similarity of being the truth. You get words such as the noun form dissimilitude. Compare that with the concept of simulate. If you simulate something, you make it very, very much like something. Dissimulate it so you're away from what it really is. So that should be paired with the ninth definition down, to put on false appearance. Our next word is compendious. When you come to that word, it usually means it's a comprehensive summary, very packed bit of information. You might have a compendious history of the world, for example. For some reason, a lot of people confuse this word with spacious. It's not spacious, so don't do that. You can see the prefix come. We've seen come, C-O-M, a lot. That means with or come with or something of that sort. It's in a lot of words in English. And we've already had the root pend. We discussed that earlier. It always has something to do with weighing or being heavy or large. In this case, it's more of the weighing. You see it with words such as pending, pendant, pensive, propensity. We talked about propensity before. That's where we talked about the pend part. So if you come with weighing everything, you really summarize everything. That should be paired up with the eighth definition down, the substance of a subject, often in a brief form. Note also the word compendium usually goes with that. That's the noun form. A compendium of knowledge would be a sort of an encyclopedia of sorts. That is, if you could compact an encyclopedia into a few words. Our next word is ascetic. The type of person who's an ascetic is one who sort of goes off into a cave and thinks a lot, usually by self-denial. You saw this a lot in medieval times where monks sort of gave up on the world. They went in the cave and they barely ate food. They gave up worldly items, so they sort of just gave up on the world. They very austere, very plain life. And it's just from a Greek word, which basically meant to forego stuff. The definition here, the origin, is not that important, but The word aesthetic is used a lot in history, and you should be familiar with it. It's often used metaphorically. Anytime somebody who gives up or leads a simple life, we use it in that way. It should be paired with the very top definition, a person who leads an austere or simple life. Our next word is bereavement. It's just the noun form of the verb bereave. And I picked this word maybe just to illustrate a point. A lot of you may be a little bit familiar with bereavement. If you've ever gone to a funeral, people are bereaving. It basically is the sadness, the post-death grief that you have after somebody passes away. And it comes from an old English word. Prefix was be and the root was refen, and we want to talk about that. It doesn't seem important, but we want to talk about it. You get a lot of words in English that start with be, beget, because, become, bemoan, and it just generally means be. If you beget something, you are able to get something. The because is you are able to cause something. If you become, it's say you're able to come something. Bemoan is so forth. So be really doesn't add a lot as a prefix, but you see it in a lot of old English words that we still have in common usage today. The refen part comes from the word which meant to rob or plunder. It's very similar to rob. And if you think about it, when you bereave something, you feel like you're robbed of somebody's company, and that's where we get it from. It should be matched up with the sixth one down on the list, mourning after a loss, especially after the death of somebody you love. Well, be very careful. Anytime you see something start with be, look at the root after that, and the root often gives you some sort of meaning that is more important than that prefix be. And you see it a lot in English. If you look at a dictionary, there's many words that start with be. Our next word is contiguous. That's a common word. I've seen it a lot on standardized tests. It means bordering, touching. For example, we talk about the contiguous 48 states. If you think about it, Alaska and Hawaii do not touch the mainland of the United States. The 48 states, they all touch each other. That's why we call them the contiguous states. The word comes from the Latin contiguous, which meant to touch. And again, you see the prefix con, with, and tig, which had to touch upon. So it's a pretty straightforward prefix and root there. Another part of that is we used to have a verb that is still in the dictionary, contiguate. We don't use that. One of the reasons that you can't study vocabulary by just getting dictionaries, there's a lot of words that aren't really in common usage now. And we still use contiguous, but we don't use contiguate anymore. So just learn contiguous, and that's really all you have to do. That should be paired up with the seventh down on the list, adjacent or touching. Our next word is penitence. I use that word for instructional reasons. If you're penitent, if you have penitence, you regret for your wrongdoing. It comes from the Latin pianitare, which is to cause or to feel regret, and it's also very closely related, poenus, to the Latin word punishment. And you see that pen in a lot of words. Penitentiary, penalty. You might see it in other words that have pen in it, so it's a very common root. And if you have penitence, it means that you're sorry. If you're in a penitentiary, you're there because you've created some sort of crime. A penalty is sort of something you've done wrong, so it always has something to do with doing something wrong. And here it's sort of a self-punishment, a sorrow for your sins. So it should be paired up with the second one down, sorrow for sins. The next word, familia, again, you may be familiar with that, but it's a little different form than you might be used to. So I want you to get used to these odd forms in English. Familia is a characteristic of being within a family. It definitely comes from the Latin familia, which is still with us. We still say family, and it has that same sense. Of course, it's a broader sense. When we think of our family, we think of our direct family, brother, sister, mother, father, that sort of thing. Maybe an extended family, uncles, and so forth. So it can be used a little bit broader than that, but mostly it just means relating to the family. So it should be paired up with the 10th item down, relating to the family. Keep an eye on that fema root. It comes in quite often. Our ninth word is omnipotent. You might also hear it pronounced as omnipotent. I've heard it both ways. It comes from two very good roots in Latin, omni, which meant all. We get all sorts of words in English with omni, omnibus, omniscient, omnidirectional. If you're omnidirectional, it's all directions, so it always means all or everything. And the other root is poten, so we have the root potent, meaning powerful. I mean, potential means you have power, and you put those together and you have an all-powerful thing. It usually refers to somebody who thinks they have a tremendous amount of power over you. Perhaps something like a god is omnipotent. They can do anything they want. It should be paired up with the fifth definition down, having unlimited power. And our last word is foible. A foible is a slight flaw that somebody has, a small defect. You might have a foible in your personality, and you might say, oh, it's a all too human foible to be selfish or something of that sort. So it's used in that sense. And it comes from an old French word which meant weak. Originally it was a weak point of a sword, but we don't really use it that way. We only use it in the sense of people now, foible. And we still have a related word that we use, feeble. It means weak. So feeble and foible sound alike. If you're familiar with the word feeble, you should associate it with a foible, and it'll be easier to remember that way. It should be paired with the fourth definition down, minor weakness. So those are those 10. Hope you enjoyed them.